welcome to the first lunch with of 2022. Today I'm joined by Whitney Iles, the Chief Exec of Project 507, which is an organisation that aims to contribute to the transformation of systems that generate violence and perpetuate cycles of trauma so that fewer people are harmed. And we're joined by Whitney momentarily. Just before that, just a reminder, we've got the Q&A function that will be operating today. So if you have a question for Whitney, or kind of indeed an observation, but preferably a question for Whitney that you'd like her to answer, then do put it in the Q&A. And that aside, we have a series of kind of discussion points that we will be going through over the course of the next hour. So Whitney, if you'd like to join me now, and then we'll get started. Lovely. Welcome, Whitney, and welcome back from Mexico. You were in Mexico just a few days ago, I think, so you must still be suffering somewhat from jet lag and trying to kind of realign your body clock.
Definitely something like that. I think I'm working on about 4 hours of sleep every day at the moment, but we move, we get it done.
Brilliant. Well, look, we're going to kind of talk a bit about your sort of quite interesting sort of, as it were, kind of trajectory of your life to date shortly. But before we do so, can you just tell us a little bit about Project 507? What it does, and and how you work.
Project 507 has predominantly kind of focused on violence reduction. So we're known a lot for our work that's directly with young people. And essentially what we do is we work with those young people who express themselves through violent behavior, and particularly those that are within the prison estate, normally within the prison estate on some kind of violent offence that may or may not have a gang association label attached to it. And that association label could be from that young person themselves or from the kind of the state and the authorities kind of projecting that onto them. But we allow that young person to kind of label themselves if they want to, or also reject those labels. And especially those who are within the prison estate who are still kind of displaying or expressing themselves through violent behavior, we kind of work with those young people, and we use a kind of psychoeducation model to support that young person in understanding more about themselves, maybe what their kind of experience of trauma feels like from a bodily perspective, to just understand a little bit more about that, to understanding their triggers, understanding the way that they identify with themselves in the world. So it's very much around kind of personal development, rather than saying, oh no, you've done this is your offending behavior and we want to change that. It's more, okay, let's figure out kind of how you can understand yourself more and what you want to do in this world that brings you joy and makes you happy, and working either very individually like we do on our Young Kings program, or working in groups like we've done kind of previously with our Butterfly Effect program, which works with young women. On the flip side of the kind of direct work, you can do direct work all day long and it can make a real amazing impact in that individual's life. But we also understand that this isn't just about the individual, this is about the system, and we need systemic change, because systems can also harm people and systems can also be violent. So we choose to also challenge and change the systems that can generate the violence in the first instance, or the systems that are harmful and can perpetuate trauma. So originally we kind of got into working in the criminal justice system, which is a complete accident, and I can definitely tell you more about that. And now what we're looking at doing is taking the focus kind of off the criminal justice system. So we're looking at systems across the board as well, and saying, okay, yes, we can understand criminal justice, but actually criminal justice is probably one of the last legs on the last kind of part of that spectrum. And if we want to look at systemic harm, we have to look at why children and young people and people end up in the criminal justice system in the first instance. So we're very interested now in looking at systems more broadly and thinking about how we can minimize harms from our systems, especially in relation to children, young people and vulnerable adults.
That kind of sounds like a sort of an enormous kind of ambitious work program. And I just kind of wonder, because in a sense, one of the things you're doing is, you say, you're you're working kind of very much with individuals as individuals and helping them to, you know, kind of reflect on their experiences and how it may have impacted upon them. But you're also kind of, you know, recognizing that, you know, those individuals are, you know, kind of related to a wide range of, you know, interpersonal and familial, you know, kind of dynamics and broader social dynamics. So, I mean, it must be, I guess, quite a challenge to kind of find the balance there between working with the individual and kind of trying to keep a sort of a system-wide perspective.
I think the balance is being able to keep both in mind. And that's part of kind of having a therapeutic approach. You have the capacity to keep both in mind. So when you're working with the individual, you can work with the individual, and yes, there is stuff around kind of individual responsibility and kind of individual behavior, but also understanding that individual is part of a wider context. So discussing that with the individual and allowing them to have that knowledge as well, and have those discussions rather than everything just being their fault. So it's that balance between what are you a part of and kind of what is your personal responsibility within that, as well as when you're doing the systems change work, keeping the individual in mind. And a lot of the times we do like system change work and we'll see changes in policies and procedures, but that won't filter down into actual kind of substantial changes for that individual. So it's about more so being able to hold both in mind at any one time. And that's what the balance is. And actually, when you have done the processing and the work on yourself and the creating the space internally to think about these things, it becomes a lot easier to keep that balance. But the real kind of the trick of it is being able to hold a lot of things in mind when you're doing a piece of work.
Project 507 is an interesting name. What can you tell us about that?
I always get asked this. Everyone wants to know what Project 507 means. And I'm going to give you the answer that I give everyone. I'm sorry. I'm not going to tell you. There is a meaning to it. And I wait until people have actually been kind of involved in the organization for at least 6 months, whether that is the kind of professionals that we train or the young people that we serve and that we support within the prisons or the community. It's kind of part of the initiation. It's part of the fun for it. And, you know, I just remember just before Christmas, I'm doing this work with the Borough of Lambeth, and we have a load of champions. I have like 25 champions across the borough. And I said this same thing to them right at the beginning of their training. They were like, what does Project 507 mean? And our last meeting prior to Christmas, someone remembered and said, you have to tell us now. So it's kind of part of the fun of the, you know, once people are around for a little bit and they're invested in the organization, I will tell them the secret behind the name. So a lot of our young people might know, but not a lot of the sector will know.
So I need to kind of do a bit of a deep search on Google, maybe someone's let the cat out of the bag, or
no, I don't
fall
think
into
so.
secrecy.
It's our play on the Illuminati, and you know, which probably isn't that much fun now after a global pandemic. But there's always that phase that I think young people kind of go through about conspiracy theories, and it kind of came from like playing on that about 10 years ago. And just I always say that, you know, the Masons have the pins, but obviously we're not allowed the pins in the prison. So I think this year might be the year that I get socks. So everyone will have their like 507 socks, so they can all see that they're kind of part of the same crew. But I like the kind of this concept of number, and it's really cool when we're on the wings and, you know, the prison officers will go, yeah, 507, and it's just it feels a bit gangy, but like in a positive, familiar type of way. And I remember kind of back in the day as well, just when guys would transfer into different prisons, they would always kind of use this same code of our 507, yeah, 507. And then what I would tend to see is guys that didn't know each other that had been on our programs kind of bond, and they would almost kind of use this 507 phrase to connect, and they would know, oh, this is someone that I can play chess with, or this is someone that would probably read the similar books to me, or have been on the same courses. So it was a little bit of a kind of an intertwine between kind of playing on the notion of gangs and how gangs are named, and how, you know, you use those street codes to form familial bonds, to kind of just having a little bit of a marketing play, and, you know, only letting certain people know what the name means.
It's kind of nice because it kind of makes it, you know, so much of the justice system and indeed practice is is kind of quite alienating. It's about, you know, them doing things to me, as it were. So it's a kind of a, it must be a kind of, as you're kind of suggesting, kind of a nice bond and a feeling that, you know, I'm kind of
and that, you know,
part
every
of
so
the
often
wider power.
a prison officer will know as well, and just like different people. So it's not like you only have to be this type of person to know. It's those who have become kind of like familiar with the organization, that are part of the organization in some way, shape or form, whether it's a partner organization or kind of one of the kind of SOs that we're kind of close with because they've been around for a long time, to young people that have been around. So it's kind of our way of saying, you know, you're part of the crew, you're part of the team.
Well, where are we now? We're mid-January, so I'll come round in sort of mid-July and kind of say, come on, Whitney, you've got to tell
You can
me.
do that. You could. I give you permission.
Okay, lovely. Now, let's kind of scroll back a bit. So tell us a little bit about kind of how you got, you know, I suppose that period from coming out of school and sort of, you know, how you got involved in this work from the, you know, from the get-go, because you've been involved in this kind of work more or less from, you know, when you were at school, haven't you?
Started youth work, some more generic youth work, at the age of 15. And I mean, that was more so I was kind of done with school, kind of emotionally done with school. But, you know, from a coursework side of things, I got through my schoolwork quite quickly. And, you know, work experience came. I didn't really have anything planned. And I used to go to the youth centre quite a lot because I love music. Music was always my first love. So, you know, back then we had like real youth centres, DJ booths, music classes, drums. I used to play drums, percussion, like I used to do loads of stuff. So when it came time to kind of get in some work experience, and I didn't really have anything planned because I was that really smart, naughty kid. Like I could get all of my, like the teachers couldn't really say anything because I was getting my A grades, my B grades, and I was completing all the work, but I was also very mischievous and I questioned authority even back then. So my youth worker at the time, Trevor Brown, who was like a father figure to me, he's passed now, he kind of brought me into the youth centre and got me working with young people from about the age of 15. And it ended up being something that I was just quite naturally good at. And I think on reflection, I've always been good with kind of other people, and I've always been good at seeing through people. So I've always been incredibly empathetic. So then to put me in an environment where I care about other people and I have to be aware of their emotions and their processing was something that became quite natural to me. So I worked at kind of one of the local youth centres, which was local authority run. And then at the same time, I was also working for one of the charity sector kind of youth organisations, which was music based. And my school, thankfully, instead of sending me to behavioural programs, they said actually the youth centres can take you. And the youth centres then trained me up and had me running the after school programs. So I was working at kind of between 15 and 17, I was working with 8 to kind of 13-year-olds. So I was doing the kind of after school programs. And it's really cool now because some of my like 8-year-olds from then, I still know them and they're 30 and they're you know, they're big grown ass men. I'm sorry, but you know, and it's really nice to see, and women, and they have kids and their kids look exactly like them, and it's really nice to kind of be a part of that journey, because it was in my local community where I'm still a community member now. So I got into it very, very young.
And you must have been kind of a, you know, for both those kids and, you know, for the other youth workers, you must have been a kind of a slightly unusual youth worker in terms of your age. But I imagine for the kids, it was probably quite good because although you were probably for them must have seemed well old, you weren't like that old, you weren't that much older.
I think back then it was quite normal to have youth workers that were quite young. The majority of those that I was working with, we were all around like a similar age. So I wasn't even the youngest in a lot of cases, especially in the kind of local authority. I had the peers that I was working with, some of them were also my age. And we were those kids that we weren't the kind of quote unquote bad kids, but we weren't the quote unquote good kids. We were somewhere in the middle of that. So we were still boisterous and mischievous, but we were still doing our work. But then we were also kind of, I was one of the founding members of like the Bexley Youth Council, for example. I was also the deputy member of the Youth Parliament kind of thing. So I was kind of politically involved even at 16, 17, as well as kind of being a youth worker, but still being a young person in a lot of settings that needed a lot of these services as well. And I think back then it was part of the culture. There was many of us that were like that.
We've got someone's just put on the chat here. You're bringing back great memories for me, Whitney, of working in youth clubs in Bristol at 14.
Yeah, see, it's I don't think I was an anomaly in it. I think this was very much, this is what youth centres before. They allowed us to kind of graduate a little bit more safely into this work. So my youth centre paid for my MVQ qualifications and all the other kind of qualifications that I needed in order to do this work. I think there's also a part of exploitation in relation to young people kind of doing this work, because when we're good at it, we get kind of put out as the poster children. And I was very much a poster child. I was on the side of buses. Like, why was I on the side of buses? That did nothing for my narcissism and my ego. But, it was this kind of, we would get rolled out into the schools and do the workshop, which was really fun. But now when I kind of reflect back on it, I think how safe was a lot of this stuff for me as a young person, because I was still, I was still very young. I was still 17 going into schools. I was still 17 with my picture everywhere, in the news all the time, doing all this politics, but still living in the same community that I was kind of working in. And there wasn't huge amounts of safeguarding for me as a young person doing this work. And I think that's kind of, there's the good aspects of it, and then there's the kind of slightly scary and more dangerous aspect of what we were doing back then.
Yeah, I mean, it must have been fairly overwhelming at that kind of age. I mean, overwhelming any age, but I mean, you said exploitation. I mean, without kind of suggesting anybody went out of their way to exploit you. And did you kind of, reflecting back on that, do you feel it was a kind of a slightly exploitative situation you were in?
I think in some situations, not in all, but I think there's, it's kind of like, it's this is going to sound really controversial, but it's kind of grooming in a sense. There were so many of us that were kind of brought in as professionals, and when you see kind of kids like us, we help get the money in as well. You need us as the kind of visuals and the spokespersons, because we're good for marketing. We help bring in the money, and a lot of this can be very, very unconscious, and it's something that we have to be very kind of mindful of. Even kind of now as a leader, I'm very mindful. Like, very rarely does anyone see any of the pictures of the young people that we work with. It's not on the website, it's not on any of this stuff, because I overthink this stuff around kind of, what are we putting out there? How are we using it? Is this? Where's the unconscious bias in this? So I think in some cases it can be exploitative if that young person hasn't been safeguarded in the process, or isn't having their trauma worked through. And I've seen, not necessarily to myself, but to my peers, I've seen kind of very dangerous practice that years later we still talk about, and we still talk about the damage that it did when we were getting asked to speak about things on the news and kind of put our trauma out there and tell our stories. I very rarely tell my story. Me and you have permission to talk about it today. I've given that consent, but very rarely will kind of people know the intimate details of my life. But back then, these were things that we were kind of told to talk about and told to express, and to treat everyone like family. And there was a lot of kind of potential for harm to be done to us. And I think a lot of people were harmed. A lot of young youth workers were harmed and continue to be harmed.
Do you kind of think that's an issue now as well? I mean, in terms of, a lot of charities, and you'll know this well in the sector, are very under great pressure to demonstrate user involvement and kind of concrete impact and lived experience. And I'm sure in many cases that can be quite empowering, but it must also,
I think it's balance. Everything is balance. Everything is, everything is creating the space to think about things. And funders really like certain things, they really respond to certain things. So there's always going to be a pressure that we need to be mindful of, on what we're doing and why we're doing it, and is this the best for the the young person. So I kind of came at things opposite. So I was always like, no, I'm not going to give any young people access to the media and da, 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 da. But then when I started to really kind of think about it and speak with a lot of the young people and my peers, some of them did want to share their stories. And I can't give a blanket no if this is something that they actually want to do. So it's about how do we create the space to safely reflect on everything that we're doing and allow people to have their voice. You know, lived experience and this kind of now notion of ensuring that lived experience is around the table. Project 507, we've always had lived experience around the table. We just never called it lived experience because you don't need to know our individual stories. You could come to one of our training and that person could have had kind of lived experience of the prison estate or not. You're not going to know the difference between who's been in prison and who's not. We've all got our own little bit of swag, and there might be certain things that you'll notice about us because of how we talk, or you know, the slang that we might use that might kind of give away some of the experiences that we've had, but we don't explicitly say this is what it is. But people have the permission to disclose if they would like to, and we teach how to disclose in a kind of a safe way and what to disclose and what not to. But our kind of predominant rule at 507 is don't disclose. No one's going to make you disclose. No one's going to put pressure on you. And I think it's about an individual choice, an organizational choice, but just having the capacity to actually think through kind of what these things mean short term and long term.
Let's move on. There's a question here, which perhaps we can come back to, about how we define success in this area and what good outcomes with young people look like. But let's hold that question for now, because I'd like sort of to move on. So you did that kind of youth work for several years.
I would say up until, I think I was running services by the time I was about 19, and I came out of employment by the age of 21. By the age of 21, I had enough. I was done with working within the charity sector because I think 21 was when we were starting to see huge changes in the charity sector. And I predominantly worked in substance misuse. That was how I kind of came into this. I didn't start kind of in gang work. I was working with children and young people that were misusing substances or had been caught for supply or possession. And, anyone that was around that time will just remember the substance misuse kind of charity sector just almost kind of imploded. The funding changed. It went over to a lot of the gang stuff and But I was also struggling. I had a very abusive boss at the time. I had a lot of personal situations going on because, as much as I've been a youth worker, I am a person that has experienced a lot of trauma and has my own story and my own pain and my own things that I've had to kind of work through, as well as kind of being neurodiverse and being autistic and not necessarily understanding and relating to the world in a kind of neurotypical type of way. So there was a whole blend of things that was going on, and I just found myself not being able to work in the charity sector as it was currently set up. So at the age of 21, I quit everything. I had about 4 jobs at the time. I've always been a slight overachiever, darling, but I quit everything. I walked, and I went to New York for a couple of weeks just to get my head straight, because I was also working in music at the same time as well. Trained sound engineer, A&R, artist development, artist management, all of those kind of things. So I went over to New York. I used to go to New York quite frequently to work. And it was at that point where doors opened for me to start doing more senior leadership stuff as well as policy work. So within the organization, one of the organizations that I had worked with as a young person or as a kind of a young adult, I kind of went up to kind of consultancy roles and service management roles quite quickly. So I'd already had a senior management experience or had been introduced to that world at quite a young age. So by 21, 22, I was then becoming a director or a vice chair. And kind of one of my predominant roles was the vice chair of an organization called Economics, which was the most amazing experience. I don't know how good I was at that role. I'm gonna be real. I'm not gonna act like I was any good at what I was doing, but I was gaining knowledge and I was gaining experience. And we were like a partnership organization with Reverend Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Push. So at 22, I was getting to go on tours with kind of Reverend Jackson. I was the person speaking before him on the stage. I was, you know, involved in a lot of critical meetings, publicly and behind the scenes, which was allowing me to understand policy and politics and systemic change and civil rights and kind of all of this kind of stuff. So there was this kind of key transition around the age of 21 where I started to get a higher level understanding of things and come out of the youth work settings.
So let's just pick up on that. So you went from around 15 or so, you sort of had enough of school, at least in terms of, you know, the kind of conventional schooling. You spent several years working in youth work, and by the early 20s, you were touring the United States with Jesse Jackson.
I was touring the United Kingdom.
Right.
I was United also Kingdom, being able to get access to, like, I was going over to New York. So New York in January used to have a Wall Street kind of conference, more so kind of Black Wall Street. So I was going over and I was meeting huge people, like people that the average person where I'm from just wasn't getting access to. And, you know, to give an example of that, one year I went over for this conference and it was the year that Obama was inaugurated. And people were just like, well, do you want to come down to Washington? And I was like, what? Like, so I remember at, like, I think 22, I'm down there at the inauguration in Congress. So not even kind of in the crowd, in Congress, being able to see the White House, see what's going on. And afterwards, I was invited, kind of me and the rest of the economics team were invited to the Martin Luther King Ball. And to be like 22 in Washington for a presidential inauguration, the first Black president, then you're at the Martin Luther King, and I'm sitting there with all the elders that used to march with King, that were at the protests, that had all the stories. And that kind of like enrichment was amazing. And it really kind of showed me how close things were. You can read all the books in the world, but when you're sitting there with the people that have the stories and you're like, you're alive. And not only are you alive, you're not really that old in the grand scheme of things. Like you're still, you know, 60s, 70s, which to me isn't old. Like, you know, you have your stories to tell. It shows you the reality of the situation. It shows you kind of what was going on and what this history looks like in real time. So I was having those kind of experiences. At the same time, I was part of the team for the Spirit of London Awards. So we were putting on these huge events to really kind of push forward positive images of children and give and young people and celebrate their wins. And then from that, I got picked up by the Children's Commission. I think I spoke at an event or something like that. No, it was the other way around, actually. I can't remember how I got picked up by the Children's Commissioner, but I did. And I'm very thankful for that, because I was running an organization at the time called No Sex Without Love. And it was very much around self-love and female empowerment, and, you know, have sex if you want to have sex, but do it for the reasons that you want to. Don't do it for kind of healing your trauma or, you know, for other people's needs. It was very much around kind of empowerment of women, teaching sexual health, knowledge of self. And from that, I ended up working with the Children's Commissioner on the 2-year inquiry into child sexual exploitation in groups and gangs. So I was getting very kind of senior level input, like mentoring, the experience, understanding policy, understanding how to do inquiries. How I know Carleen Furman, like even back then what she was doing, it was just, we were kind of parallels, coming from slightly different worlds and expressing things in slightly different ways. But it's like, she's one of the markers. Like when I see her now, I'm like, girl, and, you know, it's two roots to kind of the same thing in a sense. And to be able to see peers kind of doing what she was doing, as well as understanding the kind of the back end of this work, you know, to give that to a 22, 23-year-old was invaluable. Like this is why I have that balance of, this is what happens on a systemic change, and this is what happens in kind of frontline youth work, because, you know, for the last 15 years, it's been so intertwined for me.
I mean, that's quite a sort of, I mean, just hearing you kind of talking very matter-of-fact terms about, oh yeah, Jesse Jackson, oh yeah, Barack Obama, oh yeah, the ball, oh yeah, working on this big inquiry. I mean, by your early 20s, you'd done more than actually quite a few people probably managed to get around to doing, if at all, by their early 40s. So it was a very kind of, it must have been a real kind of hurly-burly, I mean, a tribute to you, but a kind of real kind of hurly-burly sort of helter-skelter kind of sort of life in a sense during at that period in your life.
I mean, I think kind of one of my things is I don't realize what I'm achieving. Like even now, it's only when I get to talk about it, I go, oh, okay, I've done some bits. Because I still get the imposter syndrome. I still feel like I'm not good enough. I still feel like I'm not achieving enough. And I think that's a trauma response in a lot of ways. You know, we never feel like we're good enough. So I don't, you know, I can reel off, like I was winning awards like no one's business back then. I don't really like award culture anymore, but it's like I could be like, well, I've got this award for that, and I've got a Queen's Young Leaders Award, I've got, you know, this and this and this. But for me, it doesn't mean enough. Like it's really good an achievement, but the reality is I'm still losing people. Kids are still dying. There's this real kind of reality to my life, which I don't think allows me to really celebrate some of the achievements or really think through the achievements in the way that other people might think about my achievements, because to me, it's not good enough yet. It's people are still dying, people are still hurting. And that's my kind of driving factor. I don't know if that's a positive thing. I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, this is really healthy what I'm doing, but it's the reality of who I am.
I mean, it's a very kind of driven response. You know, it's not good enough. I've done this, 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 and this. Mm. But kind of, you know, there's a kind of, I just suppose there's a side of me that kind of thinks one has to, and I wouldn't say you disagree with this, one has to kind of look after oneself in this situation and kind of, in a sense, be realistic about what an individual can achieve, you know, when faced with these, you know, kind of, as Project 507 recognizes, these very kind of alienating, dehumanizing, bureaucratic processes that kind of, as it would chew people up and kind of spit them out the other side.
I think I've learned that if we want to kind of see ourselves as kind of rebels or revolutionaries or activists or any of these kind of labels that kind of get placed on us, I think what I've learned in the last 2 years, and I know we'll kind of get to that, but the last 2 years has shown me that the biggest kind of revolutionary act that we can do as leaders in any field, but especially like community leaders, is look after ourselves and do the things that we need to do to replenish our souls, to bring joy into our lives, to look after ourselves, which is why, like, I study nutrition now. I just got back from 2 weeks away in order to do the things that I need to do to replenish myself and look after myself. I do a lot, but I also have a brain that has the capacity to do a lot. I think it's part of my autism, for example. I also know that and I don't mean this this is not sound like I'm a complete narcissist yet, but I am aware that my cognitive functioning is extremely high. So something that could potentially take someone else to do it like a week to do can take me an hour. It's just my mind works incredibly fast. I have a complete lack of social skills, so that's my weaknesses over there. But my capacity to work and to retain a lot of information and to do these kind of things, especially when something is my specialist interest, I'm going to throw myself into it, and it's what will bring me joy. Putting me in a room for 3 days and allowing me to go through my books and study and to connect the dots is one of the things that brings me joy. And it's one of the things that replenishes my soul. Sitting in the bath for an hour won't do it for me at all.
But kind of working at that sort of kind of fairly high pitch, that must make you a kind of a tough act to work with at times. I mean, how do your colleagues keep up with you?
My colleagues are absolutely amazing. And we have a particularly good way of communicating with each other. So my assistant, for example, is also neurodiverse, and we have, and my programs developer as well, I think most of my team are neurodiverse, but we know when to say, I'm having a bad day. can you pick up for me? So they know that they can pick up for me. We have particular language. We prioritize our own mental well-being first and foremost. The kind of philosophy of the company is, if we don't do this today, is the world going to end? No, go take a break, have your lunch, have your break. So we have a lot of strong boundaries in the way that we work, as well as the way that we communicate with each other. And I, as a CEO, try to be as transparent as possible around kind of what I know my skill set is and what I know my weaknesses are, and showing that I am resting. And I work from 9 till 5. I don't do any more than that. I might study in the evenings, but I don't work at weekends. I don't work for free too much anymore. I have a lot of boundaries in place, and we use clinical supervision to process any of the stuff that might come up. So I have my clinical supervisor and I have my therapist, and I do my best to be a leader in action. So I think we have a very intimate relationship within our team. They know that they can speak to me about other stuff. If they need a little bit kind of extra hours in the morning because they've had a bad night's sleep, it's all part of our culture. So I don't think I'm a tough act to follow. I think the transparency and the authenticity of what I bring to the table allows them to be transparent and authentic, and we talk through any problems that we have. And my team are solid. I love them to bits, and I have the utmost respect for them because they're all amazing at what they do. I'm not like the amazing one in the team. The whole team is amazing, from frontline practitioners to board level. It's phenomenal.
Now, kind of in your sort of, roughly speaking, mid-20s, you had a bit of a change of direction, again, kind of return to studies, and you've been, anybody who follows you on Twitter will be kind of used to, your kind of updates about your kind of latest neuropsychology, this and that. So just tell us a little bit about, how you sort of, got into kind of, clinical supervision and clinical training. And
so thankfully, due to the Children's Commissioner, this is where I was bringing it up, I was doing this work on the panel, and so I had access to the Deputy Children's Commissioner at the time, Sue Berowitz, and on the panel was Stan Rosinski, who was then the clinical director of the Portman Clinic. And the two of them together were like, you're doing an awfully lot of unsupervised work in the community, Whitney. And at that point, I was just getting into the prisons. And that was a kind of a complete accident at the time as well. So personally, and I'll disclose, personally, at that time, my mother had cancer. Someone who was like a little brother to me had cancer. So they both actually got diagnosed on the same day when I was 24. And then around the same time, maybe within the year, my best friend had his first kind of schizophrenic breakdown and ended up in the hospital. And schizophrenia runs in my family. So I've had a lot of, it's one of my triggers. It's one of the things that's caused me pain and harm, not harm, but pain and trauma within my lifetime. So it was a big, scary situation for me to see someone else that I love go through that. So I had all of this personal stuff. Then I was a complete grassroots worker, kind of working in the community by myself, doing what I needed to do to be in service with my community. And then got my first kind of prison contract because of who I was in the community. So people were like, well, come into the prisons and you can do something similar there. I never thought I was going to be working in prisons. If anyone had said, oh, that would be a good idea, Whitney, no, like that was never even a thought process in my mind. And at 24 years old, I ended up in Feltham with keys and people going, work with these guys. And a lot of them I kind of knew from the roads. They were normally brothers or friends or cousins of the people that I knew. So boundaries were just horrific. But then by the age of 26, because of Stan and Sue, and them kind of acknowledging that I was just, no one was safeguarding me, they gave me access to a clinical supervisor, which is still my clinical supervisor today. So I can't lie to him about anything. He knows me. And this then led me to developing clinically. So by the age of 26, I'm starting to go to the Tavistock and Portman Clinic. I'm starting to understand psychotherapy. I'm starting to go to classes around kind of forensic psychotherapy, studying with psychoanalysts, doing my trauma courses, my violence courses, and starting to see this at a completely, not necessarily a completely different angle, but having a language and having the tools to professionalize what I'm doing. and to put some better boundaries in place, to be able to describe what it is that I'm doing, not only to others, but to myself, and to process some stuff. And it also started me on my journey of my healing, because prior to that, I was literally working because I was in so much pain, and I was trying to stop my pain by stopping other people's pain. And I was predominantly working with the people that reminded me of the people that I'd lost. So there was a lot of projection, and there was a lot of transference and counter transference in this world, and it was just unclean work. So if you knew me prior to 26, 27, 28, or you hear any of my work there, I just apologize. Okay, I didn't know no better. But this kind of clinical journey really kind of started to clean up a lot of things for me. I was still hurt, I was still in pain, I was still processing my trauma, I still am. But it allowed me to start to bridge the gap between what we were going through in the community and what people thought about us and our pain and our trauma and our violence. And I started to become the person that bridged the gap, so I could then kind of speak to the guys that I was working with this language and break this language down and get them to understand themselves a little bit more, and the women, and then go back to these institutions to say, well, actually, you've got it wrong here, and this is this and this is that. And I think from that, I just got completely addicted to education. So I went and did my master's when I was 30 in SOAS. And I don't have A levels, I don't have an undergrad. So I went straight from GCSEs to masters. And it was one of the best decisions of my life, because it just, again, it opened me up. So now I'm doing a master's in neuroscience of mental health. I'm also doing a double diploma in naturopathic nutrition and mental health. But I think I'm probably gonna not do the full master's and go into PhD, because I've been offered PhD at the end of this year. So completely and utterly addicted to education at the moment. Need to start upping my prices so I can afford it though.
One of the things that's kind of really interesting about that is that, you know, the kind of, as it were, the conventional path, you know, you do your GCSEs, you do your A levels, you go to university, you maybe get on some kind of training course if the university course itself was not a vocational qualification, and then you go into practice, maybe at the age of 23, 24, 24, 25, something like that. And you've kind of almost done it the other way around. But actually, it's not quite as simple as that, because you've, you know, the resources and experience that you've drawn on from kind of roughly 10 years prior to some form of return to formal education must be a great resource for you to draw on in terms of your, you know, return to kind of maybe some slightly more formal sort of learning and education.
And throughout that time, I'm an avid reader. My book collection, you might be beating me right now in relation to what people can see behind you, okay? We might be on the same level, but I read, and whenever I would use and abuse elders as mentors. I would say, right, you know this, teach me what you know about this. Give me the books that I need to read. And I would go take all those books, and I'd go to this person. Give me and it was never like just one type of person. Thankfully, I've always been around multiple types of people. You know, I could be, you know, with people that are like, you know, royalty, or kind of know the Queen, work with the Queen in the evening, and the next morning I'm in the hood, and then that afternoon I'm in a Fortune 500 business, to then I'm with some philosophers at this. Like my world has never been one world. It's always been a kind of a multitude of different types of people. I've had a lot of access. So whenever I have access, I go and what do you know and how do you know it? What books have you read? Give me those books. Then I'll go read those books. I read this, did this. So I've always been very enthusiastic about being kind of inquiring knowledge and being able to put that knowledge to use. But then I think by going to university late, I had all the experience that I needed. So I could look at university and actually take from it what I needed, rather than just going through the motions, which I think has been the best thing. You know, even now, kind of being in university, and I can go, well, okay, that's what that looks like on paper, but in practice, this looks like this. So how do we translate that? And it's allowed me to kind of cultivate a mind that sees the gaps and sees the niches and automatically tries to find the solutions for those gaps. Like, how do we translate that? How do we build a bridge there? How do we kind of see that from a different angle? So I think if I'd gone like the conventional route, like originally I wanted to be a brain surgeon, And I didn't have the means, and I didn't have the patience or the focus to do that. But if I'd done that, I probably would have made an incredible brain surgeon. But I think I would have been of less benefit to the world, if that makes sense. I would have been benefit to individuals, but I don't think I would have been able to be in service to my community and to the world in the same kind of way.
Now, Project 507 has been going for about 10 years or so.
10 years this year.
Yeah. And, you know, you said that you kind of started working in prisons kind of almost by accident.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I suspect probably not entirely by accident. I know what you mean. With COVID and all that, I mean, it's obviously been difficult to work in prisons anyway, in the last year or two. But I mean, what do you see as the kind of being the main challenges at the moment of kind of doing your kind of work in, you know, something like a prison, which is kind of such a total institution, and so kind of almost, you know, almost the worst place to try to do this work, but also the place where it's most needed?
I think the challenges tend to be more systemic. It's kind of the practicalities of being able to do this work. How much of this work can you do? Everyone uses the terminology trauma-informed. We use that now because this is what everyone's familiar with, but we use therapeutic processes. And you have to be very bounded and very careful with how much you open up a person if they're going back to their cell, especially when now we're thinking about COVID and, you know, going back to your cell, you potentially can be in your cell for 23 hours a day. I mean, anyway, but pandemic, it kind of amplifies that. So I think it's very difficult to do the work. We can become a very secure and healthy attachment for young people to help them process some stuff and get them through the system. When we work with officers that understand what we do and prisons that understand what we do, it can be incredibly easier to do this work and we can process stuff. But at the end of the day, the prison institute, so not necessarily the people, but the institute, it's punitive. It's about punishment, and punishment causes harm, and harm causes trauma. So I've been having a lot of debates with myself, within my team, with Charlie and Katuna, who I love, by the way, and I'm hoping you're watching. You're amazing. You know, we have a lot of these debates around where is our place. If we think prison is a bad thing and prison is trauma-inducing, are we feeding into the beast by being a part of the system? And I think what we've been starting to do within my team, especially my board, we think a lot about what could alternatives look like. If we're now thinking about what's the next 10 years of 507, the next 10 years of 507 might be us coming out of the prison estate in order to stay authentic to our value system and come back in the community and think about what are the alternatives, because there's already a lot of kind of process and progress being made, especially taking children out of the criminal justice system. But the ones that tend to stay in are the ones that are kind of more violent. Or we can get all the non-violent ones out, but I'm interested in, okay, so what do we do with the violent ones? How can we get rid of children in prison? How can we stop sending children to prison for life? Because after 5 years, they're not really getting too much out of these, you know. After 10 years, they're definitely not getting anything out of these sentences. You know, we're probably detriment to society by these long sentences. So I'm really doing some soul searching and some kind of critical analysis around where's our place? What is the work that we're doing? Because I don't want to do the work just for the sake of doing the work or just for the sake that the work looks good or feels good. It actually has to make an impact in this world. And you know, we had a conversation a little while ago around change and the type of change we want to bring. And what I've noticed about kind of being, especially within the criminal justice sector in particular, is we become very comfortable with small change. And everything is about, don't think too big, don't have too big a vision. We want small changes. We want these little steps. Let's go for the little things. And what I've started to understand, and you know, this is my personal opinion, is that we come into this sector with all these kind of big hopes and dreams, and we then start to appease the sector. Like we shrink ourselves and we shrink our hopes and our dreams because it becomes so hard to create systemic change. That actually, do we become part of the problem by having such small successes? You know, is someone being called by their first name instead of oi, you, really a win if we came into this sector thinking children shouldn't be sent to prison in the first instance? And how do we keep these big visions? Because for me, it's starting to feel like we shrink ourselves, we celebrate these small wins in order to kind of appease a system that really fundamentally does not care about us and does not care about these young people, does not care about our community. Because if they really fundamentally cared, the changes would be a lot bigger. And we can blame systems and processes as much as we want, but there's people behind that that's not being politically brave, that are not making these choices. You know, we had a global pandemic. We were supposed to send how many people out of the prisons? And now the notion is actually lockdown was really beneficial because violence decreased or self-harm decreased. And we have to be very careful with this dialogue and what we get caught up into and how much energy we put into it, that is, we become part of the issue, part of the beast. And for 507, I'm really thinking within myself, within my team, within my peers, within the sector of what is the best way forward? Because I'm not going to do this work for the sake of doing this work. I never came into this work like purposely. So I'm not going to stay here just for the sake of doing it. So it has to have a purpose. It has to have a real measurable goal in relation to society and not just individuals' lives.
You mentioned there Charlie and Katuna, and just in brief, so you, that's Charlie Weinberg and Katuna Sinsadze, respectively from Safe Ground and Zaid Mubarak Trust, and you have a jointly authored sort of regular, irregular kind of series of essays that we publish on our website called the Critical Care series, which is, you know, kind of in part about focusing on that kind of self-care and how one can be a reflexive practitioner and kind of, you know, do transformative work in very challenging circumstances. So hopefully we'll have another one of those soon on our website, and both Charlie and Katuna are going to be future lunch with discussants. So I'm looking forward very much to both of those. But we're kind of quite quickly running out of time. These things always go really quickly. But just before we draw things to a close, I mean, again, I'm just really struck by kind of what you know, how you've kind of lived the last 15, 20 years at kind of high speed, as it were, and have done, you know, enormous amounts really in the time that you've so far kind of had in, you know, your professional career, in a way which probably for, you know, for someone who's, let's say 15, 16, 17, 18, maybe at university now, might feel rather intimidating actually. So do you kind of have any sort of thoughts or advice for kind of any students or young people who maybe want to get into this kind of work, about, you know, how to, you know, what you've learned now from, you know, where you've got so far in your life, and any advice you might have for them?
I think for me, it's don't try to do this work forever. This work should have a timeline to it, especially if you're going to work in prisons. I think that should be a maybe 5-year, kind of 10-year max. I don't think that this is something that you should do forever. I think it's something that you come in, you get some experience in, and it can really take a toll on your soul, kind of working in these environments, especially if you are from similar communities or have similar experiences, or you may be a little bit more vulnerable than other people. You know, I've said before, I'm autistic. You know, maybe me working in prisons was not the best idea in the world. Now I look back on it. And again, you know, having my own trauma. One of the things we completely missed is, you know, 2017, I was involved in a plane incident. I was on a plane that caught a light and developed PTSD from that. So I have all this kind of mental health stuff going on as well. And one of the things that I've learned from that is the importance to slow down, to have space away from this work. And when you do this work, have your tribe. So your tribe isn't just kind of within your organization. Like my tribe is Charlie, is Katuna, is Nancy Doyle from Genius Within. You know, I have a tribe of people that I can go to, that I can lean on when I need to, because it is very much around how do we look after ourselves. The revolutionary act is the self-care. It is ensuring that we don't burn out. It is ensuring that we're eating every day, that we're doing the things that replenish our soul. You know, what brings you joy, because it's very easy to lose yourself in this world, and it's very easy to have anything that you're already experienced be exacerbated. It's very easy to make kind of mistakes and then hold them very close to your heart, which then kind of blow up later on, either internally or externally. And I think, you know, for me, whether it's kind of specifically working in criminal justice, whether it's kind of working in youth work and youth violence, if you're working with people who have experienced trauma, that is always going to have an effect on you. So it's about, how do we create the space to think about how this work impacts us, and how do we create the space to think, how do we look after ourselves? I actually have like a little story that I tell in training, and we think about kind of, if you were to climb Mount Everest, right? And people climb out Mount Everest on purpose, yeah? No one's forcing anyone to do that. That would be cruel and unusual. So we do this work because we want to do it. It's genuinely something we want to do and we want to achieve. But if you was to climb a mountain, you would have a checklist of all the things that you'd need to do first off to be healthy, to do this work, to train, to kind of climb that mountain properly. So you need to be healthy to do it. You need to be able to know how to climb. You need to know what you need to do to bring all the resources with you. So you need to know that you need to have lunch at a certain time. You need to eat a certain amount of food to have enough energy to climb that mountain. So you have all the things that you have to do just to sustain yourself to climb the mountain. Then you will have potential triggers of things that can go wrong. So you're climbing the mountain and your tent rips. So you'll know if your tent rips, you now need to, you know, you've got a spare tent, you've got a backup tent, or you call this person. So there's these kind of backup plans for when things go wrong. Then there's these red flags. And your red flags are, how do you know when you're burning out? Okay, I've tried to climb today, but it's just not happening. So I feel too tired, the oxygen's too tight, I need a longer rest. So know when your red flags are, when you need longer rest, when you need kind of to do more for yourself to climb that mountain. And then also know when the limitations are there. If there was an avalanche, if there is a storm, if there's something fundamentally going wrong that you can't control, you need to not climb that mountain because it's too harmful. You need to come back down, you need to replenish, you need to replan, and then you need to try again if you want to, or you just don't climb that mountain. And I think this type of work is very similar to that. We need to have these different plans in place to know what we do so we don't harm ourselves in this.
Thank you very much. There's a couple of kind of questions that have come in. One from Charlie mentioned earlier. What do you think about the relationship between people and punishment, particularly in the light of the new bill? I'm imagining the police and crime, and I never get the order right, courts and sentencing bill. I mean therapeutically, Charlie adds. And Roger, my colleague Roger, who's asking what you think of good outcomes with young people in criminal justice. How do you define success in humanistic and social terms? Maybe about 30 seconds on each of those, if you like, and then we need to draw things to a close.
Charlie, I think we have our topic for our next critical care. So maybe we can have a proper discussion about that and actually present something back to people. Roger, I think, so the way that we do it, we actually create success indicators, not only with our contractors, but with our team and with our young people. And we have active documents where we're continually creating success indicators. And we not only measure as a project, but we measure as individuals. So a success indicator for one individual in prison might be the fact that he's woken up every morning and started to open up his curtain, because opening up his curtain is a kind of symbol of being able to let some of that light in and let something fresh in and something good for that young person, just having some light and some fresh air. Whereas for another young person, a success indicator might be getting a job. You know, they're different measurements of success for each young person and for our teams, and we need monitoring and evaluation kind of processes that reflect that. And we've been doing a lot of work in 507 behind the scenes to look at that, and one of the things that we would like to do more of is share our practice. So what we will be doing kind of later on in the year is sharing more about what we do and how we do it, our methodologies, our theories of change, and all these kind of things. They've all been worked on in the background and they will be getting launched very soon.
Whitney, it's been an absolute delight speaking to you over lunch today. So thank you so much for sharing some really fascinating insights and reflections on a really kind of an amazing career and trajectory to date, and I'm sure a lot more in the future as well. Our next lunch with is going to, in February, is going to be with Donna Mooney and Shirley De Bono, both of whom have been campaigning on the issue of the IPP prison sentence, the indefinite prison sentence. So very much looking forward to that. And before that, in early February, our next edition of Last Month in Criminal Justice will be reviewing developments during January and including asking the question why it is that the police seem so reluctant to investigate the Prime Minister and other people in Downing Street for various party and drinking activities during the COVID lockdown. So if you haven't registered for either of those events, I'm sure you'd very much like to. Be very interesting, I think, and exciting discussions, both of those. But for now, thank you again, Whitney, for a fascinating lunchtime discussion, and thank you to our audience for attending. And I look forward to seeing you at a future programme. Goodbye.